group. This is a group made up of academics looking at topics such as well-being in a climate crisis, healthy environments, promoting pro-environmental behaviors, green prescribing, and so on. What I want to cover this afternoon, I want to start by looking briefly at what is wrong with our current lifestyles. Why do we need to be spending time looking for ways to promote sustainability and well-being? Are we not already achieving these things? I'll then move on to look at the challenge presented by the climate crisis to individual well-being, to show why climate change is a key factor that needs to be considered by positive psychologists, by well-being practitioners, health professionals, anyone focused on promoting health and well-being. I'll then end by outlining some of the ways in which individuals may be able to achieve sustainable well-being, particularly taking recommendations from positive psychology research. I should emphasize that often when I'm talking about these topics, I am speaking to audiences in Europe or North America. These countries are those that cause the highest environmental impacts, and hence where we really need to see changes in people's lifestyles. Some of the ideas that I'll talk about may apply to Kenya or other African countries in slightly different ways, and I'll do my best to highlight whenever this is the case as we go through. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are probably one of the most well-known set of international targets. These are designed to be, quote, a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. There are 27 goals in total, and what's important to note is that these goals do not just emphasize well-being, which is goal number 3, but they also include a number of targets that are related to the environment and sustainability. For example, we have things such as needing to see climate action and responsible levels of production and consumption alongside these good levels of health and well-being. A term that I've been using a lot recently, and I've already mentioned it in this talk, and Mary also nicely introduced it for me as well, is sustainable well-being. And by sustainable well-being, I mean increases in individual well-being that are achieved alongside improvements in the well-being of other members of society and the natural environment. So this is a more holistic understanding of well-being that goes beyond just people, and it's this type of well-being that I think we really need to be aiming for. So then there's a problem in that the messages we're frequently exposed to about what makes for well-being and what makes for a good life are often emphasizing very materialistic ideals. So these types of messages are particularly prevalent in Western nations, but are increasingly being spread throughout the world through globalization. So we see adverts on television, in magazines, and in public spaces, which tell us that if only we buy this latest new product, we have a nice big house, or we look a certain way, then this is going to make us happy or allow us to have a certain social status. But these kind of messages are highly problematic and can lead to numerous negative outcomes, especially when individuals internalize the belief that a good life is one filled with material wealth and lots of luxury material goods. These negative consequences of materialistic lifestyles and aspirations span across 3 key areas. So to start with, holding materialistic values and goals leads to poor personal well-being for the individual holding those values. Highly materialistic individuals have been shown to have lower self-esteem, they experience fewer positive emotions, they have poorer physical health, experience more symptoms of depression and anxiety, and so on. Having a society whereby lots of people place a lot of emphasis on pursuing goals such as material wealth also leads to social problems. Highly materialistic individuals tend to interact with other people less and view others as competitors rather than colleagues, peers, or friends. And then lastly, lifestyles focused on increasing rates of consumption have obviously terrible consequences for the environment. People focused on pursuing materialistic goals tend not to care about environmental issues or the environmental effects of consumption, but ever-increasing rates of consumption do contribute to growing environmental problems, such as the depletion of natural resources, climate change, and extreme weather events. And these 3 problems all interact and enforce one another. So exposure to environmental degradation and extreme weather events can lead to personal distress and negative effects on personal well-being. But the experience of poor personal well-being also often prompts people either to isolate themselves or to seek comfort through behaviors such as retail therapy, which then go on to have more negative effects on the environment as well. This here is a paper that I published last year with Professor Helga Dittmar, who was at Sussex University, where we reviewed the negative relationship between materialistic values and different aspects of well-being. So to be clear, when I'm talking about materialistic values, I'm not referring to the actual number of possessions or amount of wealth that an individual has. Materialistic values concern the beliefs that people have about what role possessions can play in their life. And these beliefs So it's when people are thinking that items will improve their happiness or status and wanting them for their actual functional purpose. If someone buys an item because it has a functional utilitarian use for them, then this we would not class as a materialistically motivated purchase, and we don't really take issue with it. What we report in this paper is that there is a consistent negative relationship between materialistic values and different aspects of well-being, such as physical health, positive emotions, life satisfaction, anxiety, and so on. So we know that materialistic values and lifestyles are harmful to individual well-being, and they lead individuals to care less about others and the environment. On a more macro level, we also see that there are limits to which actually consuming more can benefit well-being. So these graphs are from research plotting countries' GDP and carbon footprint. So these are indicators of a country's levels of consumption against life expectancy on the bottom here, and then life satisfaction, so our indicator of well-being along the top. And what we can see in these graphs is that whilst initial increases in consumption do benefit well-being, these benefits eventually level off as higher levels of consumption occur. So it's almost a case of diminishing marginal returns. So in developing nations, increasing consumption itself can have benefits to well-being up to a point. But once we get into these higher levels of consumption, we're not consistently seeing any benefits to human well-being. I should be clear that this relationship between actual consumption and well-being is separate from the negative effect of materialistic values on well-being. Because materialism is about beliefs rather than the actual number of purchases, it has not been documented that materialistic values ever have a positive effect on well-being as of yet. So we know that materialistic values and increases in consumption do not reliably improve human well-being, yet we seem to continue to pursue them, and this has contributed to the climate crisis that we're now facing globally. Reports from the IPCC, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, are confirming that human behaviour, these desires for ever-increasing rates of consumption and production, are negatively impacting the Earth's climate. And scientists have been warning for decades now about the climate emergency that we're facing, but there are actually few signs that we're making any positive developments in these areas. What personally I'm noticing recently within the community of sustainability researchers is that there's been a shift in focus from the prevention of climate change to adaptation to living with its consequences. So people almost resigned to actually climate change is happening. We don't seem to be able to prevent it, at least not quick enough. And therefore, how do we try and live well with its effects still being present? So climate change is here. What I want to move on to consider now is the specific threats that this presents for people's mental health and well-being. There are a number of ways in which climate change negatively impacts mental health and well-being. So these can be through extreme weather events, through high temperatures, through long-term climate change, and through changing livelihoods. This figure here is from the European Climate and Health Observatory. So they outline these 4 key pathways, and they distinguish between individual and community level effects, as well as direct and indirect effects. I think really many of these pathways are interrelated and probably interact with one another. And I'm going to go through each of these 4 pathways and outline some of the type of effects that they have on well-being for you now. If we start with extreme weather events, these could be things such as severe droughts, floods, wildfires, and so on. These specific events can be extremely distressing. They may elicit a more acute negative response from the person, whereby over time their well-being improves again, or they can elicit more chronic and long-lasting negative responses such as PTSD or depression. The consequences of these events also often are things that we know will have a huge negative impact on well-being. So whether that be something like the loss of one's home, the loss of access to essential supplies such as food or clean water. People may lose family and friends, which is going to be hugely devastating for their well-being. Research also documents that there is an increase in interpersonal violence following extreme weather events. So those people who tend to be the victims of this violence, typically women, are also harmed through this pathway. If people are experiencing distress following these extreme weather events, then we also see an increase in coping behaviours, which tend to often be unproductive and harm well-being themselves. So this can be things such as alcohol and substance abuse. It has been documented that there has been an increase in global mean average temperature over the last century, hence we have the name global warming. And these increases in average temperatures also lead to changes in our behaviour. In particular, we see increases in aggression. The size of this effect has actually been documented that an increase in 1 standard deviation of temperature leads to a 4% increase in rates of interpersonal violence. And in this pathway, what's important is that some people are more susceptible to the effects of rising heat levels. So this can be particularly those people who are living in cities, where rises in temperature tend to be greater due to the material infrastructure and lack of green space in those areas. And another fact which I found really interesting and alarming is that those people who are already taking psychiatric medications, these people are less able to regulate their body's temperature as a side effect of their medications, which then leads them to experience more severe negative health outcomes as a result of high temperatures. We see higher rates of hospitalization and double the rate of heat-related deaths during heat waves for those people who are already suffering from a psychiatric illness. When people come to realize that long-term climate change is actually happening, they can have a number of emotional responses to that realization and the impacts that they think it's going to have on their lives. We're increasingly seeing a new class of emotions called earth emotions or climate emotions in response to the climate crisis, and many of these are quite negative mental states. These emotional responses are important not just in terms of individual well-being, but also because they influence behavior and actions that are or are not taken to try and combat the effects of climate change. So for example, if people feel overwhelmed, this can lead them to try and protect themselves using strategies such as denial that climate change is happening, or disavowal, whereby they deny it's any of their responsibility or anything that they can do about it. When people adopt these emotional responses, either at an individual, community, or societal level, this can lead to ineffective or dangerous policy decisions rooted in inaction, or even sometimes reversals of efforts to mitigate or prevent ongoing and impending effects of climate change. I'll introduce you briefly to some of these climate emotions now. The most often spoken about climate emotion is eco-anxiety. This is a feeling of worry or unease that is triggered by the awareness of the ecological effects of climate change. It has the same phenomenological experience as general anxiety as we typically understand it, but this emotion is specifically tied to worry about the effects of climate change. Related to this is eco-paralysis. This has some similarities to eco-anxiety in that both emotions include elements of anxiety and fear, but eco-paralysis also includes feelings of powerlessness to prevent any impacts, and so it's often accompanied by a lack of action. Solastalgia, this is an experience of grief that is triggered by the perception that one's homeland has been impacted by environmental change. It's almost like a feeling of homesickness, even though the person has not physically left their home environment. But because that home environment has been changed through some ecological consequences, so certain cultural architecture may have been lost, areas may have been lost to flooding, to fires, and so on. Because that environment has been altered through climate change, there is a feeling of grief and loss of the home environment as someone once knew it. These climate emotions that I've just spoken about, we see displayed across generations, but particularly we're seeing them in children, as these are people whose future is being most impacted by the ongoing climate crisis. In many countries across the world, we have seen the school strikes for climate movement, where young people are protesting against a lack of action by governments to combat the effects of climate change. Alongside these experiences of climate anxiety, young people also feel a sense of institutional betrayal, whereby national leaders who have typically been part of the generations that have contributed the most to the effects of climate change are not willing to work to make sure that these young people have a safe and secure world to grow up in. Now, this research into the mental well-being consequences of climate change has not just been conducted in the global north. There is growing evidence surrounding how these relationships are also occurring in the African context. For example, there is an Eco-Anxiety in Africa project. But saying that, even though there is some research within African populations that's starting to come out, we really need to see more, especially because these nations are likely to be the hardest hit by the effects of climate change, which I'll come on to in a moment. Okay, so the final pathway in the original model that we saw was changing livelihoods. This could encompass things such as certain forms of agriculture no longer being possible, so people needing to find new ways of sourcing food. But it could also be a more severe change, and perhaps the most severe that we're seeing in terms of livelihoods is that for many people, it's just not possible for them to stay living where they are. And so people have to migrate. We have seen what is now being called climate refugees. And the UN estimates that by 2050, there will be 1.2 billion climate refugees across the world. The impact of this displacement through these mass migrations are things such as a loss of or a fragmentation of social cohesion. So people are no longer living within their home communities. They may feel a loss of cultural heritage, all of which harm our well-being. What we can see in this figure here is that the majority of these climate refugees are going to come from the global south, which leads me on to my next point, which is the lack of social justice in terms of who feels the effects of climate change. We know that developed countries, the UK, the US, are historically the high emitters, the cause of the majority of pollution and carbon emissions. Yet it is those people in more developing countries who experience the negative effects of climate change first. These nations not only experience more extreme negative effects of climate change, but they also often tend to be less well equipped to take preventative measures. It's not just in terms of geographical location where we see these unfair effects, but we also see it in the case that those more vulnerable populations, such as people living in poverty, people living with mental illness, are also at an increased risk of negative effects from climate change. Just to reiterate my point here, this figure displays scores on what's called the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. This evaluates the vulnerability of human populations to extreme climate events and changes in climate over the next 30 years. It combines exposure to climate extremes and change with the current human sensitivity to those climate stresses and the capacity of the country to adapt to impacts of climate change. This figure is from 2019. A lower score indicates a higher risk of negative effects. And what we see is, again, that those nations who have typically contributed less to climate change are at a much higher risk of negative effects than those who have contributed much more to the problem. I think this really demonstrates the urgency with which we need to see change, particularly in developed countries where people need to significantly reduce their consumption levels and carbon footprints. Here, what I'm trying to do is really show people that this can be done without compromising on quality of life. This is a common misconception that prevents effective action. People think, I don't want to reduce my consumption levels or change my lifestyle because then I won't be as happy or compromise my well-being. I think this is not the case for reasons I'll talk about later in the talk. And so it's trying to communicate that message to people. For people in these more developing countries, we want them to be able to achieve good quality of life, even if this does mean that they need to raise their consumption levels. They need to have their basic needs met, of course. But beyond the satisfaction of these basic needs, we also want to help them to achieve high well-being in a way that will be sustainable for them over time and in the long term. What's promising is that as these negative impacts of climate change on our well-being are continuing to be documented, we are seeing the emergence of more and more psychology organizations focused on building sustainable futures and also helping people to deal with these climate-related negative emotions and distress. So we have things such as the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, Psychologists for the Future, Psychology for a Safe Climate, and so on. So if you are interested in these areas, then these organizations might be something that you want to look into or even try setting up your own. Now that I've given some of the problems around the pursuit of high consumption lifestyles and the resulting climate change effects for human well-being, this leads us to really ask the question, is the opposite case scenario possible? So is it possible for us to live both well and sustainably? Or in other words, can we live in ways that can benefit our well-being whilst also protecting the environment and reducing our environmental impacts? The good news is I think there is growing evidence that this type of living is possible. What I'm going to do in the remainder of my talk is outline some of the actions, largely taken from positive psychology research, that have been proposed to be able to support both well-being and sustainability. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that all of these are particularly good ideas or that they're all appropriate recommendations across demographic groups. These are just a collection of different proposals that have been made. And as I go through them, you might perhaps think about which would be most effective in the context whereby you live and work. Okay, so the first suggestion is very simple, and that is for us to live well and sustainably, we simply need to engage in more pro-environmental behaviours. So pro-environmental behaviours are actions that are typically engaged in with the intention of benefiting the environment. So it can be things such as recycling, choosing to purchase eco-friendly products, upcycling items rather than always buying new, and so on. And research shows that people who engage in these pro-environmental behaviours more frequently also tend to report being happier, they're more satisfied with their lives, they experience more positive emotions. Why should engaging in these pro-environmental behaviours positively affect our well-being? Well, one reason is that when people perceive themselves to be acting pro-environmentally, they think this means that they must therefore be a good person. In the literature, it is sometimes said that people experience a warm glow, and this perception of oneself increases people's feelings of self-worth, that they're kind of a good person, they're doing the right thing. Another reason why pro-environmental behaviour may benefit well-being is that these type of behaviours are often well-equipped to help fulfil different psychological needs. You may be familiar with a theory from the motivation science literature called self-determination theory. One aspect of this theory states that all human beings have three core psychological needs that they're motivated to fulfill. So these that people want to feel autonomous, that they're in control of their decisions and actions. They want to feel competent, that they're capable and good at what they do. And they want to feel related and connected to the people around them. Pro-environmental behaviours are well suited to fulfilling the need for competence in particular. If someone tries to upcycle or repair broken items, then this makes much better use of skill than just simply purchasing new ones, for example. Some authors also suggest that pro-environmental behaviour can become a source of meaning in life and therefore enhances the eudaimonic aspect of well-being directly. The next approach that has been outlined is slightly more complex than just increasing pro-environmental behaviours, as it involves more of a whole lifestyle change. So as a lifestyle, voluntary simplicity involves purposely trying to reduce material consumption, to live naturally, and to meet any necessary material needs as simply and directly as possible. And doing so is suggested to increase the amount of time and money that an individual can dedicate to pursuing non-material sources of satisfaction and meaning. So choices made by people who adopt voluntary simplicity often include a reduction in working hours, a relocation to more rural areas, deliberate steps to reduce their levels of consumption. And in exchange for this, individuals then often have more time and freedom to pursue other life goals, such as community engagements, time with family, artistic or intellectual pursuits, and so on. Studies have shown that individuals perceive themselves to have greater well-being when they adopt the voluntary simplicity lifestyle. These have spanned across samples such as in the US, in Canada, in the UK, and in Australia. One study in particular, which the results are displayed on the bottom of the slide here, compared self-identified voluntary simplifiers in the US to a mainstream control group, and it found that those voluntary simplifiers reported greater happiness, they engaged in a greater number of environmental behaviours, and they had smaller ecological footprints than the control group. Similarly, another study had a more international sample of people who had adopted a voluntary simplicity lifestyle, and this found that 87% reported being happier as a consequence of living more simply. Obviously, voluntary simplicity is something that we would more strongly encourage in developed nations where we need to see reductions in overall consumption levels. Whilst this way of living may also be rewarding in an African context, I'm not suggesting that it needs to be pursued if people are not already living a fairly affluent lifestyle or having their basic needs met. The next concept is somewhat linked to voluntary simplicity, but it tends to be mentioned a bit less frequently nowadays, especially in the academic literature, and this is minimalism. So this was a movement that was popularized by the two men here, Joshua Field Milburn and Ryan Nicodemus, who chose to leave their corporate careers after failing to find happiness through money. Minimalism is very much focused on reducing the amount of stuff that we own, so limiting the number of possessions that we have. People adopting minimalism can take part in certain games or challenges that they devise as a group. So one example is a game that they've proposed called Did You Miss It?, whereby people ask their friends or family members to hide certain of their possessions. And then if after a certain amount of time that person has not felt the need to look for the item, then they decide that they can pass it on to someone else or get rid of it. Other people following minimalism attempt to live with a very strict number of possessions, which they specify for themselves, and therefore each time they decide they want to buy something new, this means that they would have to give something that they already own away. There is some research to show that minimalism can boost well-being, although, as I said, this has received less attention in the academic literature compared to the other approaches that I'm going to show you. But for example, there's one study that showed that women who lived in more cluttered homes, so who had more possessions within their home, tended to show more negative moods and have higher levels of stress, even when stress was objectively measured through cortisol samples. Again, as with voluntary simplicity, this approach is most well suited to people who are already leading fairly affluent lifestyles and therefore need to have this downsizing behavior. The next approach is not so much about reducing the amount that we buy, but rather about buying different things. So experientialism focuses on spending our money on experiences rather than physical material objects. It was proposed by the author James Woolman to be the solution to our problem of what he called stuffication, that we all have or want too much material stuff. Experiential purchases are those made with the primary intention of acquiring a life experience, so an event or a series of events that someone lives through, whilst material purchases are those made with the primary intention of acquiring a material object, so a tangible object that is kept in one's possession. Examples of experiential purchases might be a family holiday to the beach or a visit to a theatre, whilst material purchase would be things such as new handbag, new pair of shoes. Although we can also see that it would sometimes be quite difficult to determine whether a purchase is strictly experiential or material. For example, if I was to buy a really trendy new bike, is that purely for the experience of riding the bike, or is there some status element to it as well, whereby I want to showcase the fact that I can buy a really expensive product? So these aren't necessarily two clear-cut categories in all cases. But research has documented that when people are asked to think about a recent experiential and material purchase, they'll rate the experiential purchase as contributing more to their own and other people's happiness and as a better use of their money. Individuals also report better mood when they're reflecting on an experiential in comparison to a material purchase. And as well as leading to greater happiness over time, it's also been demonstrated that the anticipation of an experiential purchase is more pleasurable and exciting than the anticipation of material purchase. Several explanations have been proposed as to why experiential purchases are able to have more positive effects on our well-being. The first is that interpretations of experiential purchases tend to be more favorable over time. So if you plan a hiking trip and it ends up raining the whole time, over time it's easier to forget that annoyance or to reinterpret the event to see the funny side. However, if a material purchase is disappointing, then the physical item remains the same, and so it's harder to forget the disappointing aspects of it, which leads to what we call buyer's remorse. Experiential purchases are also better able to foster social relationships, which of course themselves are an important determinant of well-being. Not only are experiences more likely to be done in collaboration with others, but people like and are more interested in pursuing friendships with others who they've discussed an experiential rather than a material purchase with. So these are kind of more experimental studies that have documented these types of effects. One thing to bear in mind with this approach is that whilst it may be good for well-being, there's pretty good evidence for that, whether it's always beneficial for sustainability is a bit more ambiguous. If someone's experiential purchase, for example, is actually a holiday whereby they fly abroad, then this is going to be much more environmentally costly than if they buy a few new luxury items at their local shopping centre. So I think the impacts of this approach on sustainability are not as clear-cut necessarily as in some of the other cases. Now I want to move on to mindfulness. This is something that receives a lot of attention within the field of positive psychology more generally. So mindfulness describes a state of being whereby individuals aim to focus their attention on the present moment. So when being mindful, people try to observe their mental states and outside events as they happen on a moment-to-moment basis, but they try not to react to them in any automatic or emotionally charged way. And by focusing on the present moment, mindful individuals are not distracted by ruminations about the past or hopes and anxieties about the future. Mindfulness is often developed through the practice of meditation, whereby people purposely self-regulate their attention. This could be, for example, to focus on internal body sensations or certain sights and sounds in their environment. Nearly any activity can be done mindfully, so it's not the case that it only happens in certain contexts. For example, you could mindfully drink a cup of coffee, which would involve focusing your attention on something like how hot the liquid feels on your tongue or the steam that it gives off. Mindfulness has its roots in Buddhist writings, where it's presented as a route towards enlightenment and spiritual development, but the practice has also gradually been taken into a secular context, and it's now become the basis of a form of psychotherapy and the topic of hundreds, if not thousands, of self-help books. And whilst practicing mindfulness has been shown to improve well-being outcomes for patients with disorders such as anxiety and chronic pain, we do not have to be clinically unwell to reap the benefits of mindfulness. Healthy individuals who begin practicing mindfulness have been shown to report reductions in stress and negative moods, as well as increases in life satisfaction and self-esteem. With the previous approaches, it was quite clear that reducing material consumption and therefore acting more sustainably was somehow inherent within the approach. However, mindfulness can be practiced theoretically in any activity. So what's the link to sustainability? So whilst the practice of mindfulness does not always require engagement in sustainable behaviours, a number of studies have now documented the positive relationship between mindfulness and how much people do engage in these more pro-environmental and more sustainable behaviours. Why do people who are more mindful also tend to act more sustainably? Well, by increasing an individual's awareness of their habitual thought processes, they can become less susceptible to persuasion from pro-consumption materialistic messages. Mindfulness has also been shown to foster empathy and compassion. So by increasing the extent to which individuals are able to appreciate how their behaviour is impacting upon people in other parts of the world and even future generations, this can motivate them to behave in more pro-environmental ways and increase their environmental concern. There is also an interesting project which was conducted by Alison Armstrong, who also did her PhD at Surrey with me. The results of these are showed on the right here. Alison's research demonstrated that mindfulness could be a suitable intervention for reducing problematic consumption behaviours. So she found that when people with a compulsive buying tendency, which is actually a diagnosis within the DSM, when they engaged in a period of mindfulness training, this led them to report lower levels of depression, hence boosting their well-being and also reduce their problematic consumption patterns. The benefits of spending time in nature are also becoming increasingly well documented. So nature contact refers to any human interaction with a biophysical system. So this can be with flora, with fauna, with geological landforms. It doesn't just have to be, for example, going out into a park or to a forest, which is what most people think of. It's also not the case that time outdoors is the only way that nature contact can be established. Nature contact can be achieved through having plants in our homes and offices, through visiting museums and so on. There's a fairly consistent evidence base showing positive relationships between living in neighborhoods with more natural features and a range of health and well-being benefits, as well as between spending recreational time in nature and positive health and well-being. Being in contact with nature helps us to feel calm. It lowers our cortisol, our stress hormone, reduces symptoms of depression, anxiety, and also restores our attentional capacity. In terms of how being in nature promotes more sustainable outcomes, some research has documented a positive effect of contact with nature on intentions to behave more pro-environmentally. However, other research has suggested that mere contact with nature is not enough, and that people actually need to feel connected to nature in order for these positive outcomes to arrive. The construct of connectedness to nature has multiple dimensions, so it can include affective, cognitive, experiential factors concerning how people feel a sense of belonging to the natural world. It's shown that people who have more contact with nature do tend to feel more connected to it, but it's not the case that nature contact and nature connection are the same. They are different constructs. So some people may happen to spend a lot of time in nature but not be connected to it, whilst others may visit nature less frequently but do experience a strong sense of connectedness. It's typically considered that nature connectedness mediates the relationship between nature contact and well-being and pro-environmental outcomes. So contact with nature does benefit sustainable well-being, but this relationship occurs because of the increased feelings of connectedness to nature that people then experience. If people feel connected to nature, that it's a part of them, then they should be more likely to care for it. This graph here on the slide shows the nature of the relationship between nature connectedness and well-being across a number of different countries. So there's a clear positive relationship here, with certain countries showing fairly high levels of connectedness and well-being, such as, for example, Spain and Portugal, whereas others, such as Hong Kong, are doing less well. The UK also does not rank very well in the study, disappointingly. What's also clear from this is that we really need to see better representation of countries from Africa or South America in this type of research. It's kind of a common limitation currently. Given the documented benefits of spending time in nature for mental health and well-being, we're seeing an increase in what's being called green prescribing. So this is where healthcare professionals will recommend to their patients to go out and spend time in nature as part of their treatment. Often this could just be going for walks in nature, as the physical aspect of this can benefit health as well as well-being. But these prescriptions can also include specific activities such as gardening, learning outdoors, also have concurrent benefits such as helping to build social networks, for example. As I said, it's not the case that time outdoors is the only way that nature contact and connectedness can be established. Researchers have distinguished between incidental forms of nature contact. So this might be, for example, I'm walking to work and I happen to walk past some trees or a pond, but it wasn't my intention when I went out to have that contact with nature. Other visits are more intentional, so when people go to a specific space to spend time in it, but the contact can also be indirect. So we have television programs now which are very much focused on nature and wildlife. Not everyone has access to green spaces locally, and so attempts have been made to increase access to nature contact across different demographic and geographic populations. For example, exposure to nature through virtual reality is getting a lot of attention within the field of environmental psychology at the moment to see if this form of contact can also benefit well-being for those people who either do not have nature on their doorstep, or, for example, more elderly population, or those people who are hospitalized and therefore not able to go out and be in nature physically. My next proposed route to living well sustainably is by trying to facilitate experiences of awe. I've purposely included this directly after nature connectedness, as the two are somewhat linked. Awe is a complex emotion that is suggested to be triggered when an individual is faced with a stimulus that they perceive to be perceptually and or conceptually vast, and therefore requires them to adjust their current mental schemas in order to accommodate this new information. Awe often includes feelings of wonder, appreciation, joy, and inspiration, but it can also at times include feelings of fear and a sense of being overwhelmed. Common elicitors of awe include nature scenes. So I think nature is actually the most common type of stimulus to elicit awe responses. The other common ones are art, music, perceiving extraordinary talents, religious experiences, even the birth of a child. Awe can also be sometimes experienced through more mundane, shared and unifying experiences, so such as through demonstrations or being at a concert, which this led the psychologist David Yaden to refer to awe as the every person's spiritual experience. When experiencing awe, people are suggested to feel small and insignificant in relation to this vast and overwhelming stimuli that they're confronted with. And this leads them to direct their attention away from themselves and widens their attentional focus towards larger entities. Often this reduction in the salience of the self during awe is also accompanied by feelings that one belongs to a larger or universal group. So this could be their neighborhood, their nationality, or the species, or something. Numerous studies have linked awe with higher human well-being. For example, awe is linked to greater levels of life satisfaction, more positive emotions, increases in meaning in life as well. But the experience of awe has also positively linked to several factors related to sustainable behaviours. So induced awe experiences can lead to greater intentions to engage in resource-saving behaviours. So these are things such as recycling, taking shorter showers. These are more pro-environmental behaviours that I mentioned before. It's been linked to reduced preference for material goods, reduced preference for conspicuous consumption, as well as a greater likelihood of purchasing more green products. Following experiences of awe, individuals are also more willing to sacrifice their own standard of living in order to protect the environment, and they donate greater amounts of money to environmental charities. Research has shown that awe can increase feelings of connectedness to nature, which we just spoke about, and this may therefore explain partly why awe is being linked to these more pro-environmental outcomes. Right, now this is my final proposal, and this is where a lot of my research has been focused, which is on flow experiences. So put simply, flow describes an experience of total immersion in an activity. So I'm engaged in my activity and nothing else seems to matter in that moment. Flow is a very popular concept within the field of positive psychology, but its links to sustainability are less well established. It was suggested by the Hungarian positive psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi that if we put our effort into creating flow experiences, then this could be a source of sustainable well-being, and that's really what I've been trying to test. Now, if you were to Google flow, you'll probably see lots of images, a bit like the one on the left here. These diagrams represent the idea that flow is an experience that tends to occur in activities that are optimally challenging. So the individual is being stretched to perform at the top of their skill level, but they're still able to overcome the challenges present. If an activity is too easy, then we usually become bored. If it's too difficult, then we become anxious. Somewhere between these 2 points is the sweet spot of flow. In addition to this matching of challenge and skill, flow is suggested to have a number of other defining characteristics. So during flow, an individual is totally concentrated on the activity, and this means that individuals stop perceiving themselves as separate from the actions they're performing because there's no attention left over to focus on themselves. For this reason, they also temporarily lose self-consciousness and they're not concerned what other people may be thinking about them. They may lose track of time. Most commonly, this is such that hours will seem to go by in minutes, and their movements can start to feel effortless because they cannot be aware of any conscious attempt to initiate them. Alongside this optimal matching of time and skill, flow is also said to be more likely to occur when an individual has clear goals and receives immediate feedback on some of their progress towards these. Flow experiences are highly rewarding and enjoyable in themselves. It's really pleasurable to be in flow, but as well as being inherently enjoyable, more frequent experiences of flow have been linked to greater life satisfaction, so there's more subjective well-being. Having one single high-quality experience of flow has also been shown to give rise to more positive emotions, with recent neuroscientific evidence linking the experience of flow to activity in neural reward circuits, as well as flow being suggested to lead to improvements in well-being. Some also argue that flow is actually a component of well-being in itself. So this here is the PERMA model of well-being, which was proposed by Professor Martin Seligman, one of the founders of the positive psychology movement. This model basically outlines 5 key factors or 5 pillars that are needed to have high personal well-being. And it's this engagement component of the model which is considered to represent flow. So flow is an experience of total engagement in our chosen activities. There's little doubt then that flow can benefit our well-being, but does it allow us to do so in more sustainable ways too? Some of our research is starting to shed a bit of light in this area. We have started by looking at exploring what type of activities the flow experiences tend to occur in, and what is the environmental cost of those activities. So to assess an activity's environmental impact, we tend to use a measure of greenhouse gas intensity per unit of time. And what we're finding in this work is that there's a significant negative correlation between the extent to which people tend to report experiencing flow in an activity and its environmental impact. So in other words, people are more likely to experience flow in less environmentally costly activities. Now, despite this negative correlation, I have to be clear, I'm not suggesting that flow always occurs in sustainable activities. There are obvious examples of activity types that people can experience flow in that are very environmentally problematic. So this might be things such as skiing or race car driving. But what we should really take from this work, I think, is that flow does not have to occur in these more high carbon activities. It can be provided just as well by more sustainable actions. And so given this, we've tried to locate those specific types of activities that tend to have the highest flow scores and the lowest environmental impact scores, which is what I'm trying to represent in the images here. And we found that these activities tend to fall nicely into 5 categories, which are romantic relationships, so spending time with our partners. We have contemplative practices, so this can be things such as prayer, meditation. Creative hobbies, so this can be kind of arts and crafts, painting, but also performance arts and things such as music. We have physical activities, so this is sports and different forms of exercise. And then the last group is actually granting time to others. And so we find that simple activities such as spending time speaking with our neighbours or playing with our children all seem to produce very high reports of flow whilst being low environmental impact. This slide just shows the results of a more recent study we've done where we've given people descriptions of flow, asked them to indicate, have you had experiences like this? And if they say yes, we ask them to say, what type of activities are you engaged in when you have the experience? The larger the word, the more frequently it's mentioned within our samples. And again, the responses are fairly consistent with the earlier work. So we have our creative activities, our music and our painting and drawing. We have our physical activities, our exercise, different forms of sports. We have our contemplative practices and so on. So one way in which flow can support sustainable well-being is therefore by making these more sustainable activities highly rewarding. And because it's so enjoyable to be in flow, this should mean that people will be motivated to keep engaging in those types of activities. But are there any other ways in which flow can help the environment? We have just conducted a study to see if flow could help encourage people to care more about the environment by influencing the strength of their personal values. So values represent people's beliefs about what it's important to strive for in life, and they're shown to be good predictors of people's actions. So people do things that are in line with their values. In this figure here is a model of the nature of human values proposed by the psychologist Isham. In this model, we've been most interested in this type of values that fall in the top right quadrant. These are self-transcendent values, which encompass how much importance people place on the well-being of other people, especially those close to them. So this we call the value of benevolence. And alongside that, we also have how much importance people place on the well-being of the environment and the world more broadly. This we call universalism. And we wanted to see whether having lots of flow experiences could lead people to hold these self-transcendent values more strongly. So we ran a study where we tested how often people were experiencing flow in their day-to-day lives, along with the strength of their personal values at various time points over 6 months. And what we found is that if people experienced increased how often they were experiencing flow, this would cause them to subsequently rate self-transcendent values as more important to them. This, I think, is an interesting finding because if flow can support pro-environmental and pro-social values, and as a byproduct, it can also then perhaps encourage engagement in behaviours that are more pro-social and pro-environmental. We're not exactly sure why this effect is occurring yet. These are quite new findings. We've not published them yet. But what we expect might be happening is that because flow can in some ways be considered to be a self-transcendent experience, this is driving the effect. So self-transcendent experiences are a category of psychological states that all share 2 core defining features. The first is that there is a reduction in the salience of the boundaries between the self and other. So commonly the self is experienced as largely independent and separate from other people in the natural world. But during a self-transcendent experience, however, people are less focused on themselves as an isolated entity. The second feature is that people experience greater feelings of connection to entities such as other people, to activities, or to nature. So flow is considered as a self-transcendent experience because during flow, there is that loss of self-consciousness, and people also experience a lack of boundaries between themselves and the activity they're engaged in. This reduced focus on the self, as well as the heightened feelings of connectedness, could in principle promote this greater care for other people and the environment. People should be more likely to care for the environment if they're not so self-focused and dedicated to pursuing their own interests. And in support of this line of thinking, we see in research that individualistic societies whereby many people hold this highly independent view of the self, they tend to have greater ecological footprints. What you can see is that there are other psychological experiences that can be considered to be self-transcendent, and these include things such as mindfulness and awe, both of which I've already mentioned as routes towards sustainable well-being. So it could be that it's this self-transcendent aspect that's also responsible for some of the positive outcomes in those other states as well. These here are just some papers that we've published exploring how this broader category of self-transcendent experiences may be able to promote high well-being and more sustainable outcomes. Recently, very happy to send these to you if you're interested in this line of thought. So now we've briefly explored a number of ways in which we can potentially enhance human well-being whilst also helping to protect the environment. Whilst I have spoken about them separately, it should be clear that these actions are not mutually exclusive. Engagement in one action can support successful engagement in another. There are some overlapping features between the different approaches as well. So for example, flow and mindfulness both involve this organization of attention. We also know that people who are more mindful tend to experience flow more frequently. Equally, through the practice of mindfulness, people may become aware and reflect on their true values more, which could lead them to discover actually they are much more pro-social and pro-environmental than they were led to believe. And so they alter their behavior to be more in line with this. So what I'm trying to say here is that we don't necessarily need to pick one approach as the best, but rather we can consider how they can be implemented in a complementary manner in a way that is appropriate for the context within which they're being used. Okay, so I will end there. To finish, I want to leave you with a quote from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He's the man who coined the term flow and has been a big inspiration for me in my work. He said that our task is to learn how to enjoy everyday life without diminishing other people's chances to enjoy theirs. And I think this quote really gets to the heart of what I'm trying to do through my work, to find ways of being and acting that can allow those of us living now to feel fulfilled, but also leave a habitable planet for all of those generations that will come after us, so they have the opportunity to do the same. Thank you very much for listening. These are just my contact details if you want to get in touch. I'm happy to take questions, but I also would just say that I've mentioned a number of times in the talk that there are certain areas where having research in an African context would be really, really valuable and is currently lacking. So if you have an interest or are doing research related to these topics and would be interested in collaborating, then please do drop me a message at some point in the future. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I hope I said something that you'll find value in.
Wow. Dr. Isham, my name is Peter Mbuga. I'm one of the board members of Positive Psychology Association. So I'm holding on for Mary Kitaka, who has had to run out.
Yeah, of course, that's fine. She let me know.
She did. Okay. Actually, from the chat box, there are no questions because I think this topic was very timely, especially the environmental issue. I don't know whether you know, currently in Kenya, we are having the hottest season that we've ever had in this country. It is so hot. A lot of our people are already going into famine mode and hunger. So this is so great. I think we've really learned a lot. That there's a lot we can do even with just positive psychology. I'm not sure you know, but we're just introducing positive psychology in Kenya. It's not being taught, especially in very few areas. And one of my take home is actually your research on flow. I didn't know it could be used to address ecological issues like as you've raised. So I'm quite amazed, and I think like most of us are just listening in awe at what the kind of work you've been doing. So with that, I would really like to ask anybody with questions for Dr. Isham. I can't see any. I'm just seeing a lot of positive comments. Very great and insightful presentation. That's Kokach saying that. We've learned quite a few new terminology, that like solastalgia. I liked what you proposed on pro-environmental behavior. And I think that's something that most of us can actually start doing. I also like the research that it improves meaning in life as well. Yes. Okay, guys, any questions? Any questions so far?
I'm just reading through all the comments in the chat. Sorry, I could see all the chat things pinging as I was speaking, but it's so hard to look while you're trying to keep your line of thought to present as well. But no, I think like just my general reflection on this area is that so often people trying to promote sustainability do so through emphasizing the negative effects of what will happen if we don't act. And so the narrative is often very negative.
Yes.
And I think the key contribution that positive psychology can play in this area is showing actually well-being is not something that is going to be harmed by us acting more sustainably. It's something that's actually going to be enhanced considerably, I think, by globally engaging in these more sustainable lifestyles. And so I think the narrative around kind of promoting sustainable change really needs to be altered and have well-being at the heart of it, because, you know, maybe most people here do care about the environment, but there's a lot of people around the world who just don't care about the environment as well. And so telling them, if you don't do this, it's going to harm the environment, they really just don't care. But if you can tell them, you know, if you do this, it will help your personal well-being and be of benefit to you, then that can be a much more convincing argument for them. So I think as well-being practitioners, as people with interest in well-being, we really need to try and showcase this link to people to make a more convincing case around this.
Absolutely. It's Dr. Selvam's comment. We have a big problem in this country with corruption and materialism. So you Dr. Selvam is suggesting that we can connect the corruption in our country to the global issues that we are actually having, because there's so much materialism. Do you want to say something, Dr. Selvam?
Yeah, I mean, not materialism as such, but earlier on in the beginning of presentation, Isham had made a connection between well-being and materialistic values. Yes. So when I was hearing that, I thought increasing corruption is due to materialistic values. I don't know if Isham would make any comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is literature to support that. So people who hold these materialistic values more strongly, they tend to care less about other people, but they also have this desire to kind of dominate other people and to have power over them. So in certain contexts, so within the workplace, there's research showing that people who hold these values tend to engage in more antisocial behaviors within the workplace. I believe there is one study, but only one, that has linked materialistic values to higher levels of racism as well. So I think definitely these type of values, they are in conflict. If you remember the diagram I showed with the different types of values in a circle, we had the self-transcendent values in the top right. Directly opposite those, and therefore in conflict, is these more self-enhancement values where people are caring about their own power and dominance. And this is where we would consider materialism to fall. So they directly conflict with the type of values that emphasize care for other people and the environment that I think we really need to promote.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Actually, one of the books that you've quoted, and I'll definitely look for it, is by James Wallman on
Yeah.
Suffocation. I'm definitely going to look for that book. I'd like to really minimize my consumption, not just because I don't have a lot of money, but I could still work on that.
Yeah, well, I think that also is a good selling point, is this idea of frugality.
Yes.
So one of my old colleagues did this of different types of consumer values that were good for the environment. And of course, one is the pro-environmental values that I've spoken about, but frugality was another one which was really positively linked to people acting sustainably, even though they don't necessarily say, I love the environment, but they say, you know, I'm more frugal and I care about my economic situation. Then that can be another route to promote these more desirable outcomes.
Okay. I have another question from Paul Kiowi. He's asking, what do you consider as the biggest barrier to adoption of the principles you have talked about, especially in the regions you have studied?
Yeah, so majority of my research, I'm collecting data on people in the UK. We've done a little bit in the US as well, because I'm collecting the data myself. I'm in the UK, it's easier for me to get the data here. The biggest barrier is that our whole societal values are so much in conflict with what we as environmental and positive psychologists are trying to promote. So all of our kind of government policy is not in line with the type of things that we are trying to encourage. So you're trying to tell people, you know, you want sustainable well-being, and then the government goes and puts in a policy that completely undermines that, whether it's kind of like fossil fuel subsidies or something like this. And so people are constantly grappling with this idea that if they're going to start acting and valuing sustainable well-being, that are they suddenly now an outsider because the government and more senior people in society are kind of channeling a way of living that's completely not in line with sustainable well-being. So I think the challenge is creating a movement that's big enough to become the norm, when the people in power who are trying to withhold the norm, that's quite the opposite. So yeah, and I guess a lot of that relates to the idea that materialism is still so dominant, and not just materialism, but also the focus on pursuing financial goals, and this kind of focus on, my PhD supervisor calls it what we should focus health over wealth, when actually often governments right now seem to be prioritizing wealth over the health of their population, which just seems ridiculous to me. So yeah, it's societal norms and government actions being not aligned with the vision of sustainable well-being that we're trying to promote. And whether those barriers would be uniform across Western developed countries, I don't know what your perception is of the kind of values and actions that your government takes, whether those would be perhaps more promising or not. But yeah, that would be an interesting study to do, would be to see to what extent that is common across the globe. But yeah, it's definitely getting governments to be online with the messages we're trying to do.
Okay. I think one more question we have is, can we still teach these ideas in developing countries where the major concern is actually poverty?
Yeah, I think they can still be taught there. I don't think they should be taught as necessarily more important than alleviating poverty, but a lot of these actions that I've spoken about are not things that need large financial or material investments. So yeah, we've just done a study, because one of the criticisms I often got of my work on flow was, oh, this is kind of a luxury. It's only for people who have the time and money to engage in these types of experiences. And I don't think that at all. And we've just done a large study looking at the relationship between demographic factors and whether people experience flow or not. And we see no association between that income or their socioeconomic status on whether people experience flow. This is something that's very achievable across different demographic groups. So I think people who are living in poverty can still engage in these different actions and find reward through doing that, but I'm not ever meaning to suggest that these things take priority above alleviating poverty, for example.
Absolutely. Okay. I think we don't have any more questions. Just a comment: young adults moving out of their parents' home when have exaggerated promotes consumerism. New households, more fridges, more microwaves, more washing machines be sold, and so on. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Well, just my immediate thought reading that is it's kind of this individualism versus more communal ways of living and being, and actually so much we're promoted that you want to go out there and prove yourself and be your own person and succeed on your own, when actually it would be much more beneficial for people to live in communities, to share and kind of work towards goals as a group would be much more effective. So yeah.